This is part 7 of Federalist number 2. A strong sense of the value and the blessings of union induced the people at a very early period to institute a federal government to preserve and perpetuate it. They formed it almost as soon as they had a political existence. Nay, at a time when their habitations were in flames, when many of their citizens were bleeding, and when the progress of hostility and desolation left little room for those calm and mature inquiries and reflections which must ever precede the formation of a wise and well-balanced government for a free people. It is not to be wondered at that a government instituted in times so inauspicious should on experiment be found greatly deficient and inadequate to the purpose it was intended to answer. Is reminding the readers that our first constitution, their first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, was written under immense pressure. Remember, they had to join together and they had to fight a war. So he said, we sent all our delegates to the Continental Congress so that they can organize the nation, get the nation together to fight a war against the British. Even when they were bleeding, even when they were in the middle of a war, even when the circumstances were tough, they got together and they wrote a constitution, which we call it the Articles of Confederation. But you all have to remember that as good as these people were, as wise as they were under a lot of pressure. They could not have mature inquiries and reflections. Kind of echoes or repeats what Hamilton had said in Federalist number 1. Remember, we're trying to establish a government based on reflection and choice. So he's saying these people did not have time to do that. It was in the middle of war, when everywhere was in flames, he says. He says the fires of war were raging all around us. So it is obvious that when that is happening, that a government instituted in times so inauspicious should on experiment be found greatly deficient and inadequate. So he says, during these difficult times, we establish a government. But this government, we know now, based on experience, is inadequate to the purpose it was intended to answer. So see, he says, should on experiment be found greatly deficient. It's got lots of shortcomings, and we know it because we've tested it. We have tested it up to now, and we have to learn lessons. So one of the most important things that he's saying here, again, indirectly, is that experience should be our guide. And that is the lesson we have to learn from this. We look at the American founding, we look at how federalism has worked in the United States, what the shortcomings were, what the major shortcoming was that led up to the Civil War. And we see what happened after the Civil War, how the relationships between the states, amongst the states, had to develop under a federal system. We'll see how this federal system answered the challenge. So these are all great lessons for us to learn. And that's exactly what John Jay is saying here. He says, we did this under pressure when the war was going on. So there are some shortcomings. It is exactly like United Nations. The United Nations was actually conceived before the war was even over. Totally was over. And now they have given 5 members veto power, okay? And these 5 members right now institute almost only a third of humanity. And pretty soon they will be only 1/4 of humanity. One thing we have to learn is that a country like India, that is soon going to have 1.5 billion people, they're not going to sit around and say, how come a country like France and England have veto power and their populations don't add up to 1/10 of our population, and we don't have anything to say? The whole continent of Africa is 1 billion people. They have no say in it. All of Central and Latin America, they're not going to sit still and say 140, 150 million Russians have a veto power, and we don't. Over 1.5 billion Muslims, they don't have a say in it. Do you think they're going to say, okay, France, with a population of less than 100 million people, can veto a Security Council resolution and we don't have any say in it? This is just a fantasy to see the world that we are in, to say that the United Nations, as it stands, is going to be answering our problems. It does not even represent us. So I want you all to be ready, because this thing is going to happen. This crisis is going to come, and we better be smart about it. Now to the next paragraph. This intelligent people perceived and regretted these defects. Well, American people saw what the shortcomings were, and they were regretting the shortcomings. They were sorry that the state of affairs was like that they could not really answer the challenges that were coming their way. Still continuing no less attached to union than enamored of liberty, they observed the danger which immediately threatened the former and more remotely the latter. So they were in the middle of a war. At that time, they knew that that was priority, that they had to fight the war. But in the background, in the back of their mind, they knew that liberty had to be preserved. They could not live as unfree people, just giving the chains, breaking one chain of being dominated by Britain and putting a chain around their neck again, handing it to somebody else. They said, no, we're going to fight this war, but we're going to be mindful of our liberty also. They observed the danger which immediately threatened the former and more remotely the latter, and being persuaded that ample security for both could only be found in a national government more wisely framed, they, as with one voice, convened the late convention at Philadelphia to take that important subject under consideration. So they decided that to be both powerful, strong, and not be defenseless in the face of enemy, and at the same time preserve liberty, they decided that they need to convene another convention. They need to send their delegates to a convention to come up with a new and a stronger and a better form of government to be established under a new constitution. And that is going to be our challenge. The United Nations, as it stood immediately after World War II, was the answer at that time. Not now. Not now that we live in an interconnected planet more than humanity has ever been. That we can be in touch with people on the other side of the planet immediately. That we can learn from one another so quickly. That we can share the wisdom of ages with our brothers and sisters everywhere. The situation has changed, so our way of dealing with things has to change. We have to be wise. We should not leave the well-being of this humanity in the hands of chance and force, because if we do not choose wisely now, then we will be played with like toys by demagogues and liars all around the world. We should start thinking about our future and start learning from the federal systems that have been in place for a while and how they came to unite, learn from their experiences, and hopefully write a blueprint, a new constitution to unite the world in a few generations.